The sand whipped across the barren expanse, scouring everything in sight. The small camp of canvas tents sat low against the desert floor, casting long slivers of shadows in the late afternoon sun. Dr. Miriam Lane lifted the edge of her wide-brimmed hat and surveyed the landscape for what felt like the 100th time that day. The horizon shimmered with heat, and her shirt clung to her back with sweat. Everything about this place felt charged, as though the desert held its breath. She had arrived with her small team 3 days earlier, having traveled across scorching dunes to reach the rumored tomb site. Their local guide, a wiry man named Samir with eyes that took in every detail, had told them the location had been known by desert nomads for centuries, but quietly avoided. When Miriam asked why, Samir only shrugged. Many who sought it did not return, he'd said in a low voice. The elders say it belongs to a time when darkness walked these sands. Her colleague, Harriet Cartwright, an expert in ancient languages and the historical sponsor of their expedition, had dismissed Samir's warning. Superstition travels faster than truth, Harriet had declared. We have rational minds, and the desert can be treacherous, but that doesn't mean we fear ghost stories. Yet despite Harriet's bravado, there was something about this place that made them uneasy. Mark Valentine, the team's photographer, spent his free time fiddling with his camera equipment, checking and rechecking the lenses, as if the normalcy of the routine might anchor him. He rarely spoke now. Their translator, a reserved older man named Fauzi, kept the conversation to practicalities only. Where to find water, how much ground they could cover in a day, and the best ways to keep snakes out of their boots at night. They had been meticulously clearing away sand from a half-buried stone entrance, believed to be the mouth of the tomb. Ancient glyphs ran across the surface of the door, a language Harriet concluded was older than any previously discovered script in this region. Harriet's eyes lit up at the prospect of deciphering them, but every time she ran her fingers along the carved symbols, the entire group felt a surge of prickling unease. Late that evening, the sun dipped below the dune crest in a rush of gold and crimson. The team quickly erected floodlights fed by portable generators, enabling them to continue working through the night. Their excitement at having discovered something so obscure overrode the bone-deep exhaustion. They pried at the stone door using iron rods, listening to the dry crunch of shifting sand and ancient mortar. With a final heave, the entrance cracked open. A puff of stale air rushed past them. It smelled of coal dust and something else, an underlying musk that nearly made Harriet gag. "Here we go," Miriam breathed, shining her flashlight into the yawning darkness. The beam revealed a descending corridor of thick sandstone walls, etched with more of the cryptic symbol. Harriet followed the beam, stepping gingerly inside. Samir felt his chest tighten at the threshold, but he followed, his sense of duty overcoming the rush of dread in his gut. As they descended, the darkness seemed to expand. Their flashlights, powerful as they were, felt weak against the blackness that pulsed in the tomb's depths. The claustrophobic tunnel led to a high-ceilinged chamber where the walls were covered in paintings, strange, serpentine figures with elongated limbs, swirls of desert storms, and tall black shapes looming over prostrate humans. The paintings looked skillful and deliberate, telling a story no one could fully decipher. They split up, examining corners of the chamber with hushed reverence. If Harriet's excited murmurs were any indication, these illustrations were all the more proof they had uncovered a key piece of lost civilization. Yet Miriam caught Mark standing near one of the walls, his expression pale and eyes darting around the chamber. When she asked if he was all right, he only nodded vaguely but looked far from composed. After taking photographs and drawing diagrams of the chamber, they left for the night, minds spinning with possibility. None of them spoke around the dinner table. The fire crackled, sending sparks up to the ink-black sky full of desert stars. Harriet pored over sketches of the glyphs, frustration tightening her mouth. "It's unlike anything I've seen," she whispered. "No parallels to Sumerian or the local scripts. Maybe I'll see something I missed in the morning. Sometimes clarity dawns when you sleep." Miriam nodded thoughtfully and said goodnight. She retreated to her tent, exhaustion crashing over her. As she sank into her cot, Miriam felt relief that the day's labor had ended at last. She drifted into a deep sleep and did not feel the chill wind that began to stir the sands outside. Some time before dawn, she jolted awake with her heart pounding. Her body was drenched in sweat, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She had dreamed of a hallway, candlelit and narrow, with walls that seemed to hum beneath her fingertips. Each step had felt heavy, carrying her deeper into an unknown corridor. At the end, a figure cloaked in black stood with outstretched arms. The figure's face, if it had one, remained shadowed, but it exuded a sense of desperation and malice so intense that Miriam had stumbled back. She tried to remember the rest of the dream, but it receded like grains of sand slipping through a fist. She only knew it had been terrible, and she was trembling in its aftermath. Later that morning, she discovered Harriet sipping her coffee with shaking hands. "Couldn't sleep?" Miriam asked with concern. Harriet lifted haunted eyes to hers. "I had such a nightmare," she whispered. "I kept hearing a whispered chant in a language I swear I recognized from the tomb's glyphs. When I turned, I saw someone or something looking at me. I'm sure it's just the tension from yesterday." She tried to brush it off, but her voice did not sound convinced. Not wanting to cause a panic, Miriam agreed it was most likely stress. But at breakfast, Mark seemed equally rattled. Dark circles underscored his eyes. He picked at his food and stared wordlessly into the distance. Even Samir, stoic as he was, gripped his cup of tea with shaky hands. Every person in that camp had faced a similar affliction, a nightmare or a half-remembered terror. It was so universal that there was no question something strange was going on. Still, the excitement of a major discovery drove them back into the tomb. They wanted to go further, to map the passageways connecting beyond the main chamber. Under Harriet's supervision, the team began carefully translating each series of glyphs. One panel in particular captured Harriet's attention. While she could not read the script, the composition of the images suggested a story, a kingdom in the desert, an unholy being worshipped in secret, and a dreadful plague of visions that befell the populace. The final image was of a massive structure sinking beneath the sands, presumably to seal away whatever evil had befallen them. Nearly an hour passed before Harriet pressed her hands to her temples. "I can't make a single word match anything known. The entire writing system is alien. If we can't decode it, we can still glean context from the pictures." She traced a particularly vivid carving of someone asleep, a swirling cloud emerging from their head. Another figure, tall and thin, loomed over them. "It looks like this being accessed their minds." Samir's voice was subdued. "You say it looks like it was sealed away here. Why open it?" He did not hide his disapproval. Miriam glanced at the man, weighing their options. Their entire mission was to uncover forgotten histories and artifacts, but a small voice in her mind echoed Samir's concern. Still, it was her job to push forward. "We only need a few more days to study the tomb," she decided, "and then we leave." As she said it, she made a silent vow that if anything more ominous occurred, she would move to close up the site. The second night, Miriam's dream circled the same hallway. At first it seemed identical to the previous dream, but she noticed the walls depicted the same paintings from the tomb's chamber. As she advanced, the figure of blackness reappeared, closer this time. It leaned toward her, and beneath the canopy of darkness, something like eyes glinted. A whisper crawled into her ears, a string of words she did not understand. Panicked, she turned to run, but the walls expanded in front of her, the corridor stretching and twisting in on itself. She bolted upright in her cot, adrenaline firing through her veins. She emerged from her tent to find Harriet and Mark crouched around the smoldering campfire. Harriet clutched a half-empty cup, and Mark looked even paler than before. "I can't do this," he mumbled. "What the hell is happening to us?" Harriet's hand rose to her mouth, stifling a sob. She was not usually prone to such displays of emotion. Miriam sat down beside them and tried to regain control of her own trembling limbs. It was Harriet who finally broke the stretched silence. "In my dreams," she said, voice hoarse, "I'm back in that buried city. I hear chanting. The words keep repeating, but I can't quite. If only I could understand them." The three exchanged anxious looks. None of them had a good explanation for the shared night terrors. They dared not confide with Sami or Fauzi yet, worried it would cause more fear. Miriam tried to rationalize it. The desert environment, the exhaustion, the psychological pressure of an extraordinary find. But deep down she understood that rationalizing did not dispel the oppressive atmosphere that clung to this place. They returned to work, forcing themselves through the day's tasks. Harriet attempted to copy more symbols from the walls. Mark photographed each inch of the corridor, and Miriam conducted a structural survey while Samir helped move fallen debris. Their sense of time became muddled, hours blending as they navigated deeper into the tomb. In the third chamber was a grand mural. A king on a throne, eyes painted solid black. Before him knelt his subjects in terror. Darkness fanned out from the throne like swirling ribbons, enveloping the entire scene. On the opposite wall, a procession of priests carried bowls overflowing with what looked like sand, heading toward a giant furnace. The shapes in these panels unsettled them so deeply that they barely spoke. The temperature felt colder here, an impossible sensation in the scorching heat above ground. That night, after they forced down some water and stale bread, Harriet insisted on staying up to read her notes. Almost everyone else collapsed into their tents. Miriam tossed and turned for what seemed like hours before sleep finally overcame her. The dream returned instantly. Once again, she stood in a corridor, the black-cloaked entity looming close. This time, Miriam felt a tug at her mind, a presence inching into her thoughts. The words in the dream turned clearer, an incantation in a language older than any human tongue she knew. She tried to scream, but found she had no voice. Suddenly, Harriet appeared in the corridor's distant shadows, lighting a torch. Mark was there too, though further away, reels of camera film unraveling at his feet. They stared at Miriam, but their faces were void of recognition. Then, in unison, they whispered something in that same ancient tongue. The black figure turned its gaze to Harriet, to Mark, and finally back to Miriam. Its darkness spread until all of them were drowning in shadow. Miriam awoke with a ragged shout. She crawled out of her tent and stumbled straight into Harriet, who stood at the ashes of last night's fire, her eyes wide with shock. Neither spoke for a moment, the unspoken question clear. "Did you see it too?" Across camp, Mark was thrashing in his tent, screaming. Samir and Fauzi hurried to wrestle him awake. When finally Mark's eyes opened, he fought to catch his breath, tears streaking sand across his cheeks. God, it was so real," he said. "That thing, it was pulling me closer, like it wanted me to." His voice cracked. At dawn, Harriet pulled Miriam aside. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm certain these dreams aren't just our imaginations. It must be tied to that tomb." Harriet's voice wavered. "The pictures, the cursed city that vanished under the sand. I think we unleashed whatever they tried to bury." Miriam felt a cold dread settle in her chest. "Then we need to leave. We could submit this site to the authorities, let them handle it. This is beyond our capability." Yet Harriet seemed torn. Her thirst for knowledge battled with the fear in her heart. "But if we go now, we'll never know. We'll have discovered something monumental and left its secrets locked away forever." Miriam deliberated. If the nightmares were the only threat, perhaps they could push through. But Mark was at a breaking point, and Samir eyed them with growing hostility for opening something that should have stayed shut. "We're leaving tomorrow," Miriam announced. "Finish up the notes today. No photography tonight. Let's pack." The day passed in anxious haste. Harriet scrawled furiously in her notebooks, determined to capture every symbol possible. Mark pointed his camera at the dust-laden corridors with shaking hands. The further they walked, the more they uncovered. Large stone caskets, smaller alcoves lined with figurines, and swirling carvings of monstrous silhouettes crouched over sleeping victims. By the time evening came, each of them felt the suffocating weight of the place. The torchlight flickered across glyphs that seemed to watch them. That night, Miriam tried desperately not to sleep. She drank strong coffee and paced the camp, listening to the wind that scuttled over dunes. Harriet dozed off around midnight, exhaustion winning out. Samir had retreated to his tent, placing wards of dried herbs around his sleeping bag as he mumbled old prayers. Mark sat cross-legged near the generator, staring at the ground. Finally, around the blackest hour, Miriam's eyes closed in spite of her efforts. The dream corridor. The black figure engulfed her thoughts with horrifying speed. This time, she was not alone. She sensed Harriet, Mark, even Samir and Fozzie, all swirling within the same hall, lost in the same dream. Their combined fear pulsed in the air like a living heartbeat. The black entity stood in the center, its form a writhing mass of shadows. Whispers spiraled around them, a language unknown yet intimately familiar. The chanting rose in pitch, echoing off impossible walls. Miriam felt her mind splinter under the pressure, as though something was trying to force its way into her consciousness. She heard Harriet scream and Mark's strangled cry. Then the black figure's attention focused on Miriam, and she sensed a wave of icy dread. The face under the hood of darkness was less a face and more the void itself. As it bent toward her, the chanting became deafening, a cacophony of despair. She felt it reach inside her mind with intangible fingers. A single word resonated in the half-formed corners of her psyche, a word she had never heard but somehow recognized. When she woke, the dawn's light was just barely touching the horizon. Harriet was crouched in the sand, sobbing uncontrollably. Samir ranted in his native tongue, cursing the tomb, cursing them all for coming here. Mark sat motionless, eyes staring into space. Fozzie watched the sky, sweat beading on his brow, his face drawn with terror. Miriam knelt in front of Harriet. "We have to leave now," she said urgently, gripping Harriet by the shoulders. "Pack up! Get out of this place!" Harriet tried to speak, but only ragged sounds came out. She nodded. A few minutes later, she drew breath, steadied herself, and began stuffing notebooks and supplies into crates with trembling hands. By noon, they had the vehicles loaded despite the scorching sun. The tomb's entrance loomed like a gaping maw in the desert, and an inexplicable sense of dread pressed on them as they packed. At last, Miriam turned to Harriet. "That's it," she said, though her relief felt hollow. "We go." They rumbled through the desert in battered 4x4s. Samir at the wheel of one, Fozzie driving the other. The wind scoured them, and the horizon stretched on, offering no sign of respite. Miriam kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half convinced the tomb itself might follow them. The day crawled. The sun hammered down, and by evening they set up camp far from the cursed site. Miriam prayed for a night of dreamless sleep. But the nightmares had not been left behind. They followed them like a living plague. That night, Mark's screams tore through the camp first. Harriet and Miriam rushed to his tent to find him in the throes of some horrific dream, perspiration pouring off him. "I'm never sleeping again," he sobbed when they shook him awake. Samir's voice trembled as he said, "It doesn't stay in the tomb." His statement chilled them all. For the next 2 nights, no one rested more than a few minutes. Each time they drifted off, that dark figure returned. Their collective mental state deteriorated quickly. Harriet refused to eat, claiming she heard voices in her head. Mark began losing touch with reality, muttering about the shadows creeping in daylight now. Only Samir kept driving. Finally, on the 3rd day, they reached a small desert outpost with a satellite phone. Miriam made the call to authorities, requesting immediate medical evacuation and reporting the site's location. She spoke in calm, measured tones, withholding the horrifying details of their nightmares. She explained they needed rescue for heat exhaustion and severe psychological distress. Help would arrive, they promised, in the form of a helicopter by sunrise. That night, Harriet scarcely moved. She sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wild. "It's in my head," she murmured. "I can't shut it out." Miriam felt the same creeping sense that some malignant entity had latched onto them. "We'll get help," she assured Harriet. "It'll be okay." Shortly before dawn, Miriam sank into a shallow sleep. The dream was instantaneous. She found herself in the corridor alongside Harriet and Mark, with Samir and Fozzie behind them. The black figure hovered, and this time it spoke in a voice that felt like razors in her mind. "Release me," it said, though the words had no sound. The corridor's walls rippled, turning transparent. She could see countless other corridors, forming a labyrinth of the mind. Each corridor contained one of her companions, paralyzed in fear. The entity glided from one to the next, feeding on them. It wrung out their hopes and dreams, devouring their will. Miriam felt its presence slip into her own thoughts, as if looking for a place to root. Torment was indescribable, a violation she could do nothing to fend off. She jolted awake to the thunderous roar of the approaching helicopter. A wave of relief briefly overcame her. Rescue had come. She leapt to her feet just as the helicopter touched down, kicking up choking clouds of sand. 2 medics jumped out, guiding Harriet and Mark aboard. Miriam and Samir joined them, while Fauzi insisted he would wait at the outpost for further instruction. He refused to set foot on the machine, muttering about carrying curses into the sky. Once in the helicopter, Harriet collapsed into a delirious state. The medics administered intravenous fluids and sedation. Miriam stared out the side window at the receding desert. The swirling dust patterns looked almost like the shapes from the tomb's murals. She closed her eyes, still feeling that insidious presence lingering in her thoughts. In the following days, Miriam found herself in a hospital bed, doctors running tests. She was told Harriet's condition was guarded but improving physically, though she remained in a near catatonic daze. Mark was under psychiatric evaluation, raving about black shapes and chanting voices. Samir broke down during an examination, screaming in his native tongue. The medical staff concluded they had experienced severe psychological trauma. On the 3rd night in the hospital, Miriam awoke to the soft beep of monitors. A chill crept over her skin. She sensed she was not alone in the room. When she turned her head, there it stood. A dark figure in the corner, silhouetted against the faint glow of emergency lights. It drifted closer, soundless, like a wraith freed from the constraints of distance and time. She shut her eyes, hoping it was a vestige of her dream. But when she opened them, it was still there. She wanted to scream for help, but her voice would not emerge. A silent tear rolled down her cheek. Bit by bit, the figure melted into the darkness, leaving her alone in the bed. Her heart hammered, and she realized the curse had followed them across every mile, across land and sky, through the sterile halls of the hospital. It was within them. She pressed a trembling hand to her eyes as a hollow understanding crystallized. The tomb had merely been the prison for this ancient horror, and by opening it, they had become the new vessels. When morning came, Harriet's bed was found empty. The staff discovered her huddled in a supply closet, scratching nonsense glyphs into the walls with her fingernails until they bled. Mark had to be restrained after attacking an orderly while shouting about shadows in his chest. Samir simply sat, catatonic, repeating the same phrase in his language that no one else understood. Miriam's own mind buzzed with feverish nightmares, creeping in even when she was awake. In her final lucid moments, she managed to secure Harriet's notebooks, fearing the hospital staff would discard them. She leafed through Harriet's frantic scribbles, sketches of the tomb's symbols, half-finished translations, images of the black figure. She found a short passage Harriet had written, or at least tried to translate. It read, "He who walks shadow in sand, imprisoned in mortal dream. Beware the watcher in your sleep. Once the door is opened, it can never be sealed." Miriam's hands shook as she closed the notebook. A nurse called her to eat, but she slumped in her chair, tears streaming silently. She thought of the tomb, now silent under the desert sun, waiting for the next curious explorers. She thought of the black entity, slithering through their nightmares, feeding on their fear. And she realized with dawning horror that there might be no escape. The dreams would continue, coaxing them toward madness and perhaps eventually freedom for whatever malignant force had been caged for centuries. She gazed out the hospital window. Even in the bustling city beyond, she glimpsed the shifting dunes of her memory. The visions of that ancient corridor flickered at the edge of her vision. She swore she saw a figure perched on the rooftop across the way, a tall, cloaked presence that vanished when she blinked too long. Even though she was surrounded by doctors, rigid schedules, and bright fluorescent lights, the darkness remained, lodged deep within her psyche. She pressed Harriet's notebook to her chest as if it were a talisman. She recognized a bitter truth. Their minds were the new tomb for that ancient evil, and if they could not find a way to shatter the bonds it had forged in their dreams, they would be consumed piece by piece, night by night, until no trace of their sanity remained. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked forward, steady and unrelenting. She felt time passing, but their nightmares were timeless. The desert's secrets had slipped past the threshold of mere physical reality and into the intangible realm of thought. Miriam suspected it was there the entity thrived best, sustained by the raw emotion of fear. They had delivered it exactly what it needed. Picking up Harriet's pen, she began to scribble across a blank page in the notebook, making hopeless attempts to record every scrap of memory from the tomb. She wrote until her fingers cramped, barely pausing for breath. She wrote about the corridor, the swirling murals, the unspoken language that seemed to echo in her mind. Perhaps if she could name the darkness, she could weaken it. She wrote about how the black figure stood at the center of their nightmares, tethering itself to their consciousness. She wrote about Harriet's final translations, uncertain though they were. And when the sedation overcame her, pulling her under, Miriam felt icy dread. In the instant before the dream claimed her, she understood she was opening a door in her mind, a door scrawled with the same glyphs they had disturbed in the tomb. She could see the figure waiting on the other side. She wondered if her last sight would be that dark shape, unspoken words crawling across her memories like a plague. As sleep claimed her, the hospital room dimmed, replaced by the corridor of nightmares. The torches guttered on the walls. Harriet and Mark stood at the margins, silent. Samir crouched behind them. The black figure loomed in the center, its hollow eyes fixated on Miriam. In the gloom, she heard one final whisper. Not a warning, not a plea, but a promise of long-dormant malevolence finally unleashed. The voice, both ancient and immediate, spoke in her mind. And then everything faded into shadow.